The history of Chicano literature. What is Chicano literature? Chicano literature is defined as any literature that has been written by a Mexican American in the United States. Chicano or Mexican American writing includes these works in which writer's sense of ethnic identity animates his or her work, often through the presentation and incorporation of Chicano characters, cultural situations, and patterns of speech. Since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexican-American authors, using various literary forms, have written on a wide variety of topics in English, Spanish, and combinations of these two languages. Origins of Chicano literature. Most of the prominent pieces of Chicano literature come after the end of the Mexican-American War, but its origins can be followed back to the 16th century. Spanish influence. The forces that created Chicano literature date from the late 16th century when Spanish conquistadores began to explore and colonize the land that is now part of the United States. Spanish influence. Coming to America during Spain's Golden Age, the era of Miguel de Cervantes, Lope de Vega, and Luis de Góngora, the conquistadores were avid storytellers and makers. They deposited legends, tales, and songs along their paths of conquest. Spanish influence. In 1610, Gaspar Pérez de Villarga, a classical scholar and companion of Juan de Onate, published his Historia de la Nueva Mexico. This historia is one of the first examples of an emergent literary tradition. The Spanish-speaking Southwest. The literary culture in the Spanish-speaking Southwest developed in a harsh frontier environment marked by episodes of cultural conflict. The literary commonly produced by frontier cultures were personal and historic narratives and poetry. Historical narratives often sought to capture the experiences of conquest and settlement, while poetry was frequently religious and based on a specific event. Until the mid-19th century, some 30 years after the Mexican independence, the literature, both oral and written, of the Spanish-speaking Southwest was not all that different from that created in the Mexican heartland. The Spanish-speaking Southwest. The authors of these narratives and poetry, especially in the early days of Spanish dominance, were government officials and priests who possessed the tool of literacy and had the means to propose literary works. Fictional works, such as novels, were rarely produced until a stable and relatively well-educated middle-class population and the introduction of more advanced technology came into existence in several southwestern towns and cities. In a setting where education and literacy were often luxuries, oral expressive forms figured prominently. Folk dramas were performed from California to Texas. Traditional Spanish plays are something adapted to the particular circumstances of the Southwest. Folk tales and legends became widely dispersed, many of which made their way north from the Mexican interior. The American takeover of the Southwest. The turning point in the literary history of the Mexican Southwest came in 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended 2 years of warfare between Mexico and the United States. A good deal of literary energy was expended in chronicling the American takeover of the Southwest. A considerable portion of its prominent Southwest Mexicanos who had supported American annexation only to feel betrayed. Most of the literary output was in the form of poetry, folktales, corridos, and a handful of novelas that were published in local regional newspapers and journals. The American takeover of the Southwest. As in earlier periods, the output of historical and personal narratives is complemented by a large output of poetry. The versifiers were largely concerned with describing a culture in transition. They wrote about the threat to Catholicism posed by Anglo-Protestants, the decline of Spanish language, and the indifference of government officials in Washington. The American takeover of the Southwest. Dozens of Spanish-language newspapers began to appear throughout the Southwest. Newspapers like Las Vegas-based La Voz del Pueblo, El Nuevo Mexicano in Santa Fe, and El Fronterizo in Tucson provided support for Hispanic writers all over the Southwest. In 1872, Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton wrote Who Would Have Thought It? And in 1882, she wrote The Squatter and the Don. She is considered to be the first Mexican-American author to write in English and is important in literature because she addressed crucial issues of ethnicity, power, gender, class, and race in her writing. In 1982, Eusebio Chacón writes his two novelettes El Hijo de la Tempestad and Tras la Tormenta de la Calma. He was also New Mexico's first novelist and took pride in his pioneering efforts to establish Nuevo Mexicano literary tradition. By 1900, the Mexicano literature had emerged as a distinctive part of the literary culture of the United States with its origins Spanish and Mexican, its language primarily Spanish, and its religion Catholic. Despite its growing particularity, it remained within the orbit of Latin American letters and oral tradition. For the most part, Mexican-American writing proceeded along established lines of development until 1945, when Mexican Village, a novel written by Josefina Negli, was produced. Mexican Village was the first literary work by a Mexican-American to reach a general American audience and was clearly intended to convey to American readers the distinctiveness of Mexican-American experience and expression. Not surprisingly, the Second World War greatly accelerated the process of Mexican-American acculturation by stimulating the movement of Mexican Americans into large cities to support military industries. A well-known work, Rudolfo Anaya's Bless Me Ultima, although written in 1972, focuses on the impact of World War II on a small community in New Mexico. In 1934, George Ainsley wrote Los Pochos, which set a precedent in the structure and themes of later Chicano novels. Pocho is considered one of the first Chicano novels, and it received widespread recognition upon publication in 1959. Like other forms of ethnic expression, Mexican-American literature received a boost from the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Several Chicano publishing houses were created around this time, most notably Quinto Sol of Berkeley. Among the major writers nurtured by Quinto Sol were Rudolfo Anaya, Rolando Hinojosa Smith, and Thomas Rivera. From the 60s, with the awakening of Chicano literature, there is an attempt to counteract racial cliches against Chicanos. This literature differs from Anglo literature in its continuous reference to Mexico as the mother country, the place where their culture began, and in its mixture of the Spanish and English languages. With the emergence of U.S. Chicano social movements in the 1960s, a number of young Chicano writers also surfaced and synthesized the base of new literatures which were consciously and specifically ethnic in character and function. The Chicano movement encouraged the rise of a number of prominent novelists, playwrights, poets, and short story writers. The poem I Am Joaquin, written by Jorge Gonzalez in 1967, is considered an important literary contribution and became the leading expression of Chicanismo. The Chicano literary renaissance, which was a flowering of all forms of literature by Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest, began with the start of the Teatro Campesino in California, founded in 1965 on the Delano grape strike picket lines of Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers Union. The company created and performed short skits on flatbed trucks and in union halls. During this literary renaissance, writers reaffirmed their ethnic identity and addressed their community through fiction, poetry, essays, and works of drama that responded to political, economic, and social history. In Texas, the Renaissance started in 1969 with the publication of poet Abelardo Delgado's 25-piece of Chicano Mind, and lasted for about 10 years of renewed literary activity among Mexican Americans in the state. The literary movement in Texas achieved national stature with the 1971 publication of the novel Y no se lo tragó la tierra, translated as And the Earth Did Not Part, by Thomas Rivera of Crystal City. The book was awarded the first Quinto Sol Award from Quinto Sol Publications. Some writers were also published in Chicano literature anthologies produced by the Southwest and in literary journals established in Texas. Two important periodicals were Tejidos and Caracol. Tejidos and Caracol gave a voice to many working-class Tejano writers who brought their pages penetrating themes and innovative writing styles. The Renaissance began to end when the annual literary gatherings moved from Texas to other states in 1970. In 1973, Rolando Hinojosa Smith won the Quinto Sol Award for Estampas de Valle y Otras Obras. He received international recognition in 1976 when the Latin American literary world honored him with Casa de las Américas Award for Cleo City y sus alrededores. During this time, Oscar Z. Acosta published the autobiography of a brown buffalo and the revolt of the cockroach people, two semi-autobiographical novels demonstrating the philosophy of Chicanismo. However, many other prominent authors and poets also emerged during this time. Since the advent of Quinto Sol, and more recently the bilingual press of Arte Público, Chicano literature has expanded impressively in all directions. No area of recent Chicano writing has yielded more satisfying works than poetry. Since the beginning, poetry has been a popular form of literature among Mexican Americans. Some of the most important Chicano poets include Gary Soto, Jimmy Santiago Vaca, Jose Montoya, Juan Felipe Herrera, Rey Gonzalez, and Carlos Cumpian, among others. Gary Soto is probably one of the best known of Chicano poets because of how highly regarded he is in the literary world. Among Chicana poets, Bernice Zamora and Lorna de Cervantes have been particularly powerful voices. In her collection, Restless Serpents, Zamora inveighs against boundaries created largely by men that restrict not only action but emotion and sexuality. In her major collection, Emplumada, Lorna de Cervantes celebrates the Chicana's poetic voice even as she laments the continuing circumstances of male oppression. Other prominent Chicana poets include Pat Mora, Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherry Moraga, and many others. Among the more gratifying developments in Chicano writings recently has been the emergence of a strong group of women authors. By and large, these writers have been concerned with liberating the voices of women in Mexican, Mexican-American, and American cultures that have not been traditionally supportive. Influential Chicana authors include Sandra Cisneros, Ana Castillo, and Denise Chavez. The short story has also become extremely popular among Chicano authors today. An important short story writer today is Estela Portillo Trambly. Her short stories and other works have had a profound impact on other feminist writers. Elena Maria Viramontes is also an influential short story writer. Over the years, there are several common themes that have appeared in Chicano literature, including identity, social and political protest against exploitation, the immigration experience, life in the barrio, and the unity of all Hispanic people. Come on. Of all the themes previously mentioned, the theme of identity has inspired the most literary focus. The question of identity has always been an integral part of Chicano literature because there is the realization by writers that they are no longer Mexican and they are not accepted as true Americans. The desire to create a unique identity by taking parts of both cultures has led to the creation of a literature that reflects a distinct Chicano culture. Literature is seen by many Chicano writers as a natural way to articulate their feelings about discrimination, racism, and civil rights, as well as to develop their search for identity and roots. However, Chicano writing is not merely a literature that reacts to the ills of American society, but rather a literature that is defining itself, giving itself form and content, creating rather than reacting. This form of the literature, while still drawing on the literary tradition, is becoming increasingly creative and separate from tradition. The chances are it will continue to be a detrimental part of Chicanismo for years and years to come.